Hey, everybody. Welcome back to Direct Station. I'm so glad you're here, where politics and planets collide and converge. I am Kate Carey. My goal here is to help create some context for what we're living through, for what's happening in and around us by looking at patterns in the sky that correlate with what's happening around us here on Earth. I do need to start today with several chilling developments that revealed themselves over the weekend. The Trump administration has begun what can only be described as a hostile campaign targeted publicly at what they're calling immigrants or criminal immigrants. But they're abusing, they're disappearing, and they're detaining such a wide variety of travelers, refugees, residents, citizens, that it is, of course, by design, difficult to even track what the hell is going on. The number of news stories on this topic have exploded. In the last several days, we're seeing reports of tourists and travelers being detained at airports across the country, shackled to chairs, put into solitary confinement, strip searched, cold showered, not fed or given water. People who arrived legally with proper documentation or people in a legal process now finding themselves caught in an expanding, immoral, disgraceful, and honestly, truly, actually quite evil dragnet. It has a similar tenor to what happened to families separated at the border during Trump 1.0, if we remember that. But this is the next step in this sort of rise of systemic cruelty and a disgusting use of the state to harm, to humiliate, to destroy. The most chilling part of this development, of this nightmare, of course, is the one in which they are using the Alien Enemies Act, a law last invoked to justify the internment of Japanese Americans during World War II, one of this country's darkest hours, most shameful acts, right? Up there. So they're using that same law, that same act to deport Venezuelans, over 200 now, to El Salvador without due process. What I mean by that is that immigrants who came here as refugees have been rounded up, pulled without explanation off the tracking system that their lawyers or their families use to find out where they are within the ISIS system. So pulled off of that system, flown without warning or hearings, handed them over to be held with much social media fanfare, posting videos of it, like sizzle reels of it, giving these Venezuelan refugees to this notorious, crowded mega prison where visitation and recreation are forbidden. If you've had the misfortune to see the oppression porn released by the administration promoting this action, which I should add was taken in violation of a judge's order, judge told them to turn the plane around, and they didn't. If you've seen this, which I'm calling oppression porn, let me get high off watching someone else suffer. Someone I know nothing about. Then you may have some idea of the way these people are being treated. If you haven't seen it, I will say that it is one of the harder things to watch on social media today. It's very disturbing. You'll see shaven, identically clothed men crouched into humiliating, mortifying postures and run through ritual dehumanization in order to demonstrate their absolute powerlessness and subjugation. This is a place that the dictator ruler of El Salvador has used to publicize and sell his solution to gang violence, a place he incarcerates his own young men who have been swept up in raids and detained without due process with much terror and intimidation. And it would seem that the model attracted the sadistic eye of the Trump administration, who cut a deal with this leader and paid them upwards of $6 million of taxpayer money to take these men for the crime of being in the United States without due process, but publicly accusing them of being members of a gang. A few of them may be. I would argue that this treatment is appropriate for no one, but whatever is the best match for reforming or stopping violent gangs, surely the rule of law in a free society requires that they be charged, defended, proven guilty before their lives are ruined just because they're from a place that has gangs. These aren't isolated incidents. They represent a significant acceleration of the patterns we've been tracking. The breakdown of systems, the dissolution of legal boundaries, the intensification of suffering for vulnerable populations in particular. So today I want to connect these disturbing developments to a powerful astrological pattern that helps explain, though certainly not excuse, why this is happening now. Neptune is reaching the final degree of Pisces, its home sign. This transit represents the culmination of a 165-year cycle. And historically, similar moments have coincided with both extreme suffering and powerful awakening. Before we dive into that, I want to be clear. Understanding cosmic patterns doesn't diminish the urgency or the action or the reality of human suffering. Rather, it helps us contextualize it and make meaning of what's happening and recognize that these moments, however horrible, have historical precedent and are part of a larger cycle of breakdown and renewal. I find that getting a little meta about what it all means each day helps me to trust more deeply what is unfolding inside me, between us, and all around us. It's all about to shift while we're here, while we're watching, while we're trying to understand. And we are a part of what causes a change and what allows reclamation of our truest values, what occurs in this country. In other words, I'm not trying to offer you spiritual bypassing. I would even argue that being fully present in the suffering, in the hellscape, in the horror, makes us more fully alive and more able to be part of the solution that uplifts all of humanity. But we are certainly in a vice. And that vice, if we're looking at the giant clock in the sky, is taking place at 29 degrees of Pisces, which is the end of the zodiacal cycle, and 1 degree of Aries, the beginning of a new era. We are at that fulcrum here together. That's why it feels so big, and that's why it feels so hard. Let's start with what's actually happening on the ground. Using the Alien Enemies Act, an obscure law from 1798 that allows this president to detain or deport nationals from countries with which the U.S. is at war, the administration has begun removing people without the usual legal process. The critical thing to understand is that we are not, in fact, at war with Venezuela, making this application of the law particularly alarming for legal experts, right? The president instead declared an invasion by a particular gang from Venezuela. And upon that basis, he is using this law. These 200 or so Venezuelan men weren't chosen for deportation because of any crime. Many had been living and working in the U.S. for years, even decades. They were selected because of their nationality, rounded up and sent not to their country of origin, but to a third place, El Salvador, and placed in a prison known for its inhumane conditions. The common thread is the erosion of established legal boundaries and due process, fundamental protections that have defined who we are as a country for generations. For those directly affected, this isn't about politics or cosmic patterns. It's about fear, uncertainty, acute suffering, families separated without warning, lives uprooted, futures suddenly thrown into question. The human cost is immeasurable and demands our attention, regardless of where we stand politically. It doesn't matter who you voted for, y'all. What matters now is our humanity, our ability to see, to bear witness, to demand change out of all this cruelty and suffering. To quote Yeats, things fall apart. The center cannot hold. These developments represent exactly the kind of acceleration we discussed in our last episode about the eclipse season. Events that would normally take months or years to unfold are happening in days or weeks. Another way things that were previously unimaginable are revealing themselves is around this abrupt cancellation of the Voice of America. This is an organization that is a collection of radio stations that pipe true news, albeit from an American perspective, but fact-based reporting into countries where true news is illegal and largely unavailable. These stations have served as America's voice to the world through the Cold War, the fall of the Berlin Wall, countless global events beginning in 1942. Their sudden silence in Iran, Russia, China, represents another institutional norm evaporating at this hour. It is being celebrated by these countries. So the dissolution of America's communication with the world, precisely when transparent communication is most needed. This is so wild, so awful, and so wild. Now, let's look at the astrological pattern that helps explain why things are really starting to come apart at the seams. Why is this fabric that holds so much of our world fraying and tearing? Well, it's about an old fella named Neptune. That's the planet I want to talk about today. Neptune, known to the Greeks as Poseidon, the guy in the sea, rules the vast ocean and everything beneath its surface, both literal and metaphorical. So as a planetary archetype, Neptune governs the dissolution of boundaries, representing where the solid gives way to the fluid, where the known merges with the mysterious. So associated with the foggy realms of dreams, intuition, and the collective unconscious. The collective unconscious. Neptune blurs the lines between reality and illusion, truth, deception. In mythology, Neptune wielded his trident to create both destructive tsunamis and life-giving springs. He embodies the dual nature of water itself. That which can both sustain life is required for life, and that which can overwhelm or wipe life out. As a planet, Neptune takes approximately 165 years to complete its journey through the zodiac, making its transitions particularly significant for collective experiences. There's always something popping when Neptune is moving neighborhoods. When Neptune's energy is expressed positively, it manifests as transcendent compassion, artistic inspiration, spiritual connection. But its shadow emerges as delusion, addiction, escapism. The drowning of consciousness, if you will, rather than its expansion. Both ways are possible. Everything has its light and its shadow, right? So these are the choices when we're talking about Neptune. In our lives, Neptune represents where we dissolve into something larger than ourselves, for better or worse, where the droplet rejoins the ocean, right? So just think about the dream, the trance even, that we see so many of our countrymen in, and so many of our neighbors and family members and colleagues now slowly but surely beginning to awaken from that dream. Do you have people in your life who are beginning to awaken from that dream? I bet you do. So Neptune is currently at 29 degrees Pisces, the very final degree of the sign it rules, and the very final degree of the zodiac itself. In astrology, the new cycle begins with Aries. Aries season, which we're entering this week, yay, crocuses are here, is when things start sprouting, right? And growing, living anew, right? So Neptune has been at the last degree of Pisces, and it's about to enter Aries. But the last degree, the 29th degree of any sign, is known as the anaretic or critical degree, a point of culmination and often crisis that demands resolution. It's like the final seconds of a really good game when everything intensifies and reaches its conclusion. It's like the climax of a story. It's like the last great battle of a war. It's the scene in a movie where the epiphany comes. It's the moment in Law and Order where the murderer confesses on the stand. It's that scene in The Truman Show where Jim Carrey's character reaches the literal boundary of his artificial world and must decide whether or not to cross into the unknown. It's the Red Wedding, which, if you think about it, was the moment that everything we thought was true or sacred or reliable in the Game of Thrones universe explodes in front of us and informs us that we are entering an entirely new phase of action. Or going further back, think of the Beatles' rooftop concert, their final public performance together, literally on the boundary between earth and sky. You're seeing the 29th degree there, the anaretic degree, the turning point. Each sign has one. And the one in Pisces, before the whole entire cycle starts anew and launches into Aries, the place of action, causing, of doing, is the biggest deal of them all. And that is where we stand. So Neptune, who, again, governs boundaries, illusion, compassion, collective consciousness, is in this last degree, this monumental degree of Pisces. Its home sign. Neptune in Pisces represents both our highest capacity for compassion and our deepest vulnerability to, drumroll, delusion and manipulation. At this final degree, we're experiencing the culmination of patterns that began when Neptune entered Pisces in 11 and 12. Look at what's happened since then. The rise of mass migration globally, increasing polarization around borders and national identity, the blurring of fact and fiction in our information ecosystem, and the gradual erosion of institutional boundaries. And now, at the final degree, these themes aren't just present, they're reaching this fever pitch, right? The boundaries between legal and illegal, between compassionate policy and cruel enforcement, between truth and propaganda are dissolving before our eyes. We are all aware of people who today literally cannot tell the difference between truth and propaganda. And that is so painful to witness, particularly in people we love, right? It feels like we've lost them to that dream. It's so confusing. It's so maddening. There's some evidence that Neptune reaching its climax has a ton to do with it. And remember, this Neptune transit is happening simultaneously with a bunch of other things that don't usually happen all at once. One planet is adding rigid enforcement to this. The nodes are doing their thing, breaking down systems. Another planet is activating defensive emotions around home and homeland. There's more, of course, but remember, this is just a wild ride and a perfect storm. So let's look at the patterns associated with Neptune for a moment to better understand what we're living through. This moment has a precedent. The last time Neptune completed its cycle through Pisces was in the late 1850s and early 1860s. Just pause so you can take that in for a moment. When Neptune shifts signs, it usually bounces in and out a bit before settling down. That'll happen here too. It'll bounce into Aries starting on the 30th of this month of March, and then it'll go back and forth across that boundary, finally ending that border dance in 26. During that previous cycle with Neptune at the end of Pisces in the late 1850s and officially beginning to flirt with this wild 29th degree in, wait for it, May of 1860, the United States Civil War started less than a month prior, while Neptune was real close at the 28th degree. So this was, like now, a period that profoundly reflects Neptune's power over collective dreams and illusions. Two totally incompatible visions of America were colliding. One built on slavery, one on freedom, both representing different national dreams about who we were as a country, both very different dreams about who matters and who doesn't, about whose body has integrity and autonomy and whose doesn't. Eerily familiar, right? Whose life has meaning and significance and is worth treating with care, and whose life is a detail or a chess piece or an unfortunate tale. This period also saw the Dred Scott decision in March of 1857, when Neptune was firmly in the Pisces dream and setting up legal structures for what happened as it headed towards this climactic 29th degree. So through that Dred Scott decision, the Supreme Court decided that Black Americans could not be citizens. It represented a devastating removal of legal boundaries and protection that bears uncomfortable parallels to what we're seeing now, was the deportation and detention of legal residents. The late 1850s also saw the rise of the Know Nothing movement. This was an anti-immigration, anti-Catholic political movement that sought to restrict citizenship and deport the foreign-born. This rhymes with our current moment. It's difficult to ignore the pattern. What's particularly Neptunian about that period is the creation of illusory compromises. Political fictions like the Kansas-Nebraska Act that attempted to paper over fundamental contradictions through collective denial. The Kansas-Nebraska Act was a law that created something called popular sovereignty, which allowed territories to decide on the slavery question for themselves. In other words, a compromise based on the illusion that democracy could function when fundamental human rights were negotiable and available to some, but not all. Eventually, these illusions could no longer hold, right? The center cannot hold. And the union literally dissolved, the ultimate expression of Neptune's energy, before reforming into something new. Now, importantly, I am not raising the Civil War as a specter of what might be about to happen. Of course, it might be about to happen. Everybody says that. Everybody's noticed that. But it is not destined to happen. The sky is quite different than it was in 1816. There's a lot of other influences, a lot else going on, a lot of other cycles coming to a head. What I want to talk about today is this dissolution of the boundaries and the forming of something new. The 1850s also saw the power of Neptune's visionary potential, right? It saw the rise of the abolitionist movement, the Underground Railroad reaching its peak effectiveness at the dawn of the war, as Neptune hit that climactic degree, right? And the dream of freedom that seemed impossible started to take real hold of the collective imagination. That inspiring vision erupted collectively as Neptune danced on the border that it is now dancing upon, right? And this collective vision, this dream of a more perfect union, emerged from the same Neptune energy that created the delusion, the dream of the South that was based in denial and a brutal, blinding hierarchy. Two dreams. So out of this Neptune cycle came America's most persistent collective illusion, the lost cause mythology that romanticized the Confederacy and distorted our national understanding for generations. This Neptune and Pisces delusion has shaped our politics right up to now. It has hung with us. It has been less powerful, but it has regained its power now, right? As we reach that same degree. And as the cycle completes, we are being asked, finally, to answer its fundamental questions. What a cool opportunity for our country, right? Looking at other Neptune cycles, we see similar patterns. As Neptune completed its journey through Aquarius, for example, at the end of 11 and 12, we witnessed both the Arab Spring and the suppression of it, the Occupy movement, the global refugee crisis as millions fled Syria. The pattern is clear. Neptune cycle completions correspond with the dissolution of boundaries and the exposure of collective delusions. So the awakening of visionary movements and the resistance to cruelty. We saw this in the 1950s when Neptune was changing neighborhoods with the Lavender Scare. And again in the 1980s, it was changing neighborhoods during the AIDS crisis. So now the biggest neighborhood change of all is happening, and we're seeing these themes rise intensely. Then as now, LGBTQIA communities, immigrant communities, communities of color become scapegoats for collective anxiety as boundaries between us and them, me and not me, mine and not mine, simultaneously dissolve as equality threatens, and then those boundaries are violently reinforced. But these communities also often lead to a stronger, clearer, more effective resistance, creating new forms of mutual aid, of taking care of my neighbor, of seeing across lines of difference, and solidarity that eventually reshapes society. It has happened before. It is happening now. What's happening now, the deportations, the abject cruelty to families, the brutal persecution of trans children and adults, the detention of tourists, the silencing of Voice of America, these represent our current national illusions reaching their breaking point. Like the 1850s and the 1860s, we're witnessing competing dreams of America, of what we will be, colliding with reality, creating both suffering and simultaneously the possibility of profound transformation. I know you see it. I know you feel it. So what comes next? Next, Neptune moves into Aries. Neptune will move into Aries at the end of the month and bounce a bit and settle in 26, beginning a new 165-year cycle. Historically, Neptune's entry into Aries has corresponded with new social movements based on direct action, such as the rise of the early women's suffrage movement during the previous Neptune and Aries transit, pioneering approaches to a collective compassion, such as the establishment of the Red Cross during that last Neptune and Aries period, bold initiatives to address humanitarian crises, such as the Freedmen's Bureau created during the Civil War to support formerly enslaved people, a revolutionary art and spiritual practice, such as the emergence of the Negro spiritualists as a formal, documented musical tradition during that last Neptune and Aries period. The key insight here is that what we're witnessing now, however disturbing, is the culmination of an ending cycle, not the beginning of a new normal. The darkness often intensifies just before a cycle completes, and there is possibility in what comes next. The darkest hour is just before dawn. This is not Shangri-La that we're entering, of course. There's an opportunity for ugliness in the shadow of any sign. But the idea that there's an illusion or a dream that has taken hold en masse that will be released through our collective action is exciting. The final degree of Neptune in Pisces calls us to be both compassionate and clear-eyed. This is a moment for both witnessing suffering and working to alleviate it. And most of all, to respect what's rising and know that it's the end of a cycle that has taken lifetimes to develop. Okay, so given this understanding, how might we respond to these developments? First, we stay informed about what's actually happening. Neptune at 29 degrees of Pisces creates maximum confusion, intentionally, in many cases, right? So with the loss of the voice of America in authoritarian countries, we see a parallel here in the US where it has become so difficult to know what is fact and what is made up, right? So we need to seek out primary sources, legal analysis, firsthand accounts from affected communities. Second, we need to support organizations directly working with detained and deported people. Groups like the ACLU, immigrant rights organizations, legal aid services, they're on the front lines. Even small donations multiply when we all participate. Third, document what's happening. Neptune in Pisces corresponds with attempts to rewrite reality, to erase history, right? To gaslight an entire population about what is and is not happening, what has and has not occurred, record, share, and preserve accurate information about these events. You are a primary source. Fourth, recognize that we're in a transition period that will eventually resolve. This doesn't minimize current suffering, but provides context that can help sustain hope and action. Neptune in Pisces dissolves boundaries. Neptune in Aries will initiate new forms of collective action, and that starts on the 30th. Finally, practice both compassion and clarity. Neptune's highest expression isn't delusion, but transcendent compassion. Seeing beyond artificial divisions between you and me, between us and them. Leaning into a shared humanity. Seeing into communities that aren't like yours. Seeing into people who aren't like you. And remembering that the shadow of Neptune isn't just confusion, it's escapism. So turning away from suffering because it's too painful to witness, that's Neptune. We need to seek balance with your substance or your escape mechanism of choice, if you have any left. And if you don't, seek balance as you invite others into consciousness and care. Do so without judgment or dogma. Those too are part of the delusion. So let's go into the second half of the week, knowing that Neptune's transit dance into Aries, beginning at the end of the month, suggests that a more direct, action-oriented approach to collective compassion will emerge from this period of confusion and suffering. Adrienne Rich once said, "My heart is moved by all I cannot save. So much has been destroyed. I have to cast my lot with those who age after age, perversely, with no extraordinary power, reconstitute the world. That's the Neptune and Aries energy that follows this difficult passage, the perverse reconstitution of the world through ordinary courage and clarity. So as we navigate these challenging times, I want to share a poem that speaks to both the dissolution of boundaries and the courage to witness suffering without turning away. This poem is Kindness by Naomi Shihab Nye, an American poet born in Missouri to her father, a Palestinian refugee, and her mother, a German American. Naomi grew up between Jerusalem and San Antonio, and much of her writing is about peace, love, as it were, in a time of conflict. She is largely a children's author, and she's a poet, and I'll share just a few bits of her incredible offering, Kindness. Before you know what kindness really is, you must lose things. Feel the future dissolve in a moment like salt in a weakened broth. What you held in your hand, what you counted and carefully saved, all this must go, so you know how desolate the landscape can be between the regions of kindness. Before you know kindness as the deepest thing inside, you must know sorrow as the other deepest thing. You must wake up with sorrow. You must speak to it till your voice catches the thread of all sorrows, and you see the size of the cloth. Then it is only kindness that makes sense anymore. As we witness the dissolution of boundaries that once protected vulnerable people, you'll remember that this moment, however painful, is part of a larger cycle that will eventually turn towards new forms of compassion and action. We have it in us. And this is our time to feel the sorrow. This is our time to respect the magnitude of what has been wrought by this dangerous dream as we gather our strength to lead ourselves out of it. I will leave you with three things. One is an action: support any organization working directly with detained or deported people. A reflection: consider where in your own life you might be experiencing the dissolution of these boundaries or structures you once relied on. How might this connect you to the larger patterns we're discussing? And an inspiration: throughout history, moments of greatest cruelty have catalyzed moments of profound compassion. The end of one cycle creates space for the beginning of another. If you are finding value in these conversations, please follow Direct Station on your favorite podcast platform and leave a comment or a review. Not only does that help others find me, but I'd love to hear how these patterns are showing up in your life and what questions you have. Your experiences help all of us understand these cosmic patterns better, make meaning of our context. And do let me know if you'd like to have a visit and look at your chart as you sort through this time and decide what you'll do next. Until next time, may you see the dream clearly for what it is, and may you have the courage to feel what you're feeling as Neptune completes its journey through Pisces. I'll talk to you in a day or two. Until then,